Hello, welcome to this very special edition of Neoliberal Centrist Dad. I'm Nick Tyrone. I would like to welcome my guest today, all the way from Brisbane, Australia, to join us. This is Drew Pavlov. And Drew, I will let you introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on, Nick. Look, I am a supporter of liberal democracy and liberalism. We are in obviously very dark times. I do my part to kind of wage information warfare against supporters of fascism, communism, people who want to destroy liberalism and democracy. And yeah, we are in very dark times right now with the emergence of this kind of axis between China, Russia, and Iran, North Korea as well, and with also Trump seeming to want to align himself with this despicable axis. So we're in obviously very dark times right now, and I just do my part. I'm only 25 years old, and I study law part time, and I just basically write. I'm on Twitter. I film as like a sort of independent reporter as well. I make YouTube videos. I just came back from Ukraine last week when I went to the front line, and I saw some horrific stuff there. I saw an apartment block that was blown up just one day after Trump shut down intelligence sharing. So, for me, these issues are really real, and I'm very passionate about them. So I'm very happy to be on your podcast because I think we probably see eye to eye on a lot of issues.
I think we do actually, yes, and it's
Yeah.
great to see some of the stuff. I followed obviously a lot of the things you've done on Twitter, and was very interested, obviously, in your visit to Ukraine. I myself, I went to Ukraine. The last time I was in Ukraine was 2006, so very, very different time.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very different world. And,
Yeah.
and you've been there, well, just recently. So could you tell us a little bit about your impressions of Ukraine? Well, just yeah, give me some of your impressions of Ukraine just to start.
Yeah. Gee, the fact that you were there in 2006, I would have been 7 years old back then. So, I'm quite like new to this sort of like long-term battle, but I mean, it's sad. I mean, I grew up, my formative political experiences were watching Trump get elected to the presidency and Brexit and all these things. So yeah, I was thrust right into the deep end. Look, Ukraine right now, it's really interesting over there. I mean, one of the things that surprised me the most, I mean, I shouldn't have been surprised because obviously people are human beings everywhere. So, you know, you shouldn't, I guess I shouldn't have been so surprised by this, but I was so surprised by the fact that, life can be so normal for a lot of Ukrainians while this horrible war goes on. Like just the resilience there, the fact that they continue to try live life is obviously like quite incredible. You go through Kiev, and if it were not for the nighttime, basically the nightly bombings, if it wasn't for the nightly bombings in Kiev, I mean, Kiev is such a beautiful city, and it's very safe to walk around through the day, etc. It's just, obviously at nighttime, the Russians bomb the hell out of the city almost every night. But that's the incredible thing. When you're in Kiev, you're in a European capital, you're in an amazing, beautiful city. And you sometimes can forget almost that, this is a country that's facing a long-term genocidal threat to its very existence. I mean, that is what Russia wants. Ultimately, you see JD Vance and Trump talk about, oh, this is just like a sort of limited border conflict. Nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, this really is existential for Putin. He doesn't believe that Ukraine has its own language, history, culture. He really thinks that they're basically just, brainwashed. That he thinks that Ukrainians have just been brainwashed against Russia. That's his sort of mindset. He doesn't think that Ukraine is a separate nation, and we saw that in his sort of interview with Tucker Carlson. But yeah, just seeing the fact that life can go on while this horrific warfare continues is just really incredible. And I guess that's a testament to the human spirit and the spirit of the Ukrainians. Some of it is just so dark and bleak. I mean, I went to Dobropilia, which is a town that's very close to the front lines. Dobropilia is basically the last sort of major town before you head out to Pokrovsk, which is basically the center of the major fighting right now in the Donbass. And the Russians have been advancing for a long time in that area. And I went to Dobropilia. I reported from the site of an apartment complex, that a Khrushchevka, like an old sort of Soviet-style apartment block, that had just basically been incinerated and destroyed by a Russian Iskander ballistic missile and a series of cluster munition attacks as well. Yeah, so I saw this, this scene of what was a horrific war crime and a massacre. The Russians actually waited for the ambulances and the firefighters to arrive before hitting with a cluster munitions double tap strike. that killed even more people. I walked through some of the incinerated apartments. It was really clear that dozens of people were killed. The official death toll was 14. I think, unfortunately, many more people were likely killed because, I mean, just the extent of the destruction. It's almost impossible for human beings to survive that. And, something that was just so, bleak and dark, but also, I guess, sort of a testament to the Ukrainian spirit. Like, you walk down the block and I saw all these families lining up for aid. They were repairing shattered windows, etc., in nearby surrounding housing complexes. And you walk down the block, and like 400 meters down the block, there's like a pizza cafe, and there's like a cafe that's open, and people are sitting down having lunch, drinking coffee, etc. And you're like, wow, this is incredible. I mean, it's just to see that in the fact that life goes on 36 hours just down the street from a massacre site where 36 hours before dozens of people were just murdered in their beds. I mean, that's just really disturbing. I mean, and it's not the Ukraine's fault. They are just human beings. They're just trying to continue to live their lives. Like, they have to maintain some semblance of normality, because otherwise, there would be mass psychological crisis. The country would fall apart if people weren't able to try and sort of reconstruct some semblance of normality. But it's just to see that stuff in real life, though, and to see that is such a different thing to reading about it, I guess, in the papers or watching YouTube videos. I mean, that was something that will really stick with me. I mean, I'd never in a million years been involved in anything resembling sort of like wartime. I'd never seen in a million years anything like war, and to then be walking through the side of a massacre where a missile blew up an apartment complex, and 1.5 weeks later, I'm now back in Brisbane at my house with my dog and just going about normal life, going to university. I mean, that's a very sort of chilling and strange thing as well, like just to return to normal life when the Ukrainians don't have that opportunity. I mean, they try and make the best of their lives, but every night they could just be burned alive in their beds. And that's the reality of Russia's sort of terror campaign, the nightly bombings that they carry out against the Ukrainians. Just seeing that for the first time is just so disturbing.
I can imagine. So having been there very, very recently,
Yeah.
you have an insight that none of us who haven't been there at all since, particularly I myself, haven't been there since the war started. Well, I would argue that obviously I'm of the opinion that Ukraine has to win. It's a vital
Yes.
for the continuance of the West and holding off Putin, etc. But I guess the question is, having seen it, do you think they can win?
I actually absolutely believe that they can win. So, one thing that struck me, I went out to the Donbass. I went, within like 15 kilometers basically of the front line in the Donbass. We sort of embedded with some drone units and some Ukrainian military personnel. They flew a drone over the battlefield in Pokrovsk. We saw, rows and rows of burning houses. No, we actually went out there in the Donbass. And here's something that, it really struck me. And I mean, it might seem like a simple point, but it really, I mean, I guess it's something that really, really comes to you when you're actually there. So it's just the vastness of Ukraine. So at the moment, for example, the Russians are losing, hundreds of men, potentially up to 1,000 a day, making these, small 100-meter advances in the Donbass. And they've literally been fighting in the Donbass for 11 years. And, they're still, the first fighting started in 2014 when Russia first invaded the Donbass. And 11 years later, literally 11 years later, they're still only 30, 40 kilometers out from the city of Donetsk, which they seized in 2014. So we're talking about 11 years they've advanced maybe 40, 50 kilometers. Like that part of the Donbass, I mean, the Ukrainian soldiers are so hard and the defenses are so deep and entrenched. And you see like they're literally fighting over every last square inch of territory. And, they're losing hundreds of men every single day, almost like pouring their own men into the wood chipper to, gain 100-meter advances in, Pokrovsk in the Donbass. And, driving into the Donbass, we went through this city, Pavlograd, which is like 120,000 people or 150,000 people, whatever. And, there's daily life there. We saw mums sort of like, taking their kids in strollers. We walked past the playground and there were kids everywhere. So there's still life, in Pavlograd. And you just think to yourself, like, my God, like the Russians are losing like 1,000 men a day to take like 100-meter advances in the Donbass. Pavlograd's 50 kilometers back or 100 kilometers back from the front line. Pavlograd's this city of 130,000 people. I mean, Bakhmut, the Russians potentially lost up to 100,000 casualties to take a town that was prior to the war about 80, 90,000 people. And so when you actually get to Ukraine and when you go out to the Donbass and you see just like the vastness of the place, like the massive expanses that we're seeing, like the vast, massive expanse of Ukraine and how, deep the defensive lines go. And you realize you just get a sense of the futility of the Russian war effort. It is literally a wood chipper. It's literally a meat grinder. They're literally losing 1,000 men a day, taking 100-meter advances. I mean, if they were to eventually get to somewhere like Pavlograd, Pavlograd again would be like a 3-year battle for them. Like it took them almost like a year to take Bakhmut, 80,000 people. Pavlograd's like 150,000 people. It's further back from the front lines than, that's the thing. Like every single town they get to, it's this like entrenched, brutal, street by street, house by house fighting. And they lose so many men. And it's just like, that's every single town. And there's a town behind that town. There's a town behind that town. It just goes back and back. And Ukraine's such this vast country. And the people there are just so committed to, they're just so committed to the existence of their country. Obviously, people hate the war. People want the war over, but no one's going to accept Russian occupation. That's the thing. That's the sense of the place, right? Like if there was a way to somehow magically stop the fighting, of course, everyone would pick it. But everyone realizes occupation's worse than fighting. And so the fighting goes on. And, the Russians are losing 1,000 men every day, 100-meter advances. When does it stop? I mean, the futility of the Russian war effort, when you see just how vast this country is, how hardened the Ukrainian defenders are, you just really get a sense of like, this is impossible for Russia. They can't consume the entire country. They're going to try to. That's what they want to do. And I mean, they've already lost potentially up to 1 million men. You actually start to wonder, like, at what point can that society tolerate even more, further casualties? Like these are World War I numbers now for Russia. We're literally seeing like sort of World War I casualty figures, and they're gaining 100 meters a day. Like, I mean, it's just insanity. It really is insanity. You can't comprehend it from our mindset in the West. That's one thing that I guess really came to me. Like, you just cannot comprehend it from the perspective of, somebody growing up in, peaceful Western democratic society. You can't comprehend the mindset of the Russians where they're willing to lose 1,000 men a day every day for 5 years to take 100 meters a day. It's just insanity.
How worried should we be though about things like, Trump's attitude towards the Russians, however you want to phrase that? There was this, obviously, Tucker Carlson is a whole other issue, which would be a whole other podcast, which we don't have to get into. But that interview he gave with the negotiator.
My God.
Yeah. How worried should we be about that stuff?
This is the crazy thing. I mean, like as a rational human being, you just can't actually understand how naive these people can be. I mean, the most innocent thing, the most innocent answer we can have for this is that it's extraordinary naivete. And the worst answer is that they really are fully in cahoots with these people. They really genuinely, and that's the dark thing. And I think increasingly, unfortunately, that's how I see it. I think it's not just naivete. I think they really genuinely crave this kind of like, they just basically want Dugin's multipolar world, which is just insanity. And, Dugin and Solovyov, some of the top Russian propagandists, they're boasting online like, now America's actually on our side against Europe, and we're going to join together and we're going to fight the forces of globalism together. And the disturbing thing is, I think this is actually how a lot of very senior people in the Trump camp think. And you saw Putin when he had this meeting, when he had the now infamous meeting with Zelensky. We saw Putin basically say, we saw Trump basically say, "Oh well, Putin actually went through a lot together. We went through a lot together during the fake Russia witch hunt." These were Trump's words, and he was basically talking about, I went through that together with Putin. He's a comrade in arms because we were both persecuted by the Democrats. Like, this is how they're seeing things now, and probably the most disturbing thing as well. Like, you go to Ukraine. And the Russians are so effective at just slaughtering people. They're so effective at slaughtering civilians and carrying out these nightly terror bombings. But, just militarily, I mean, their military was really shown up in February 2022 when they tried this massive combined arms offensive in Ukraine. They essentially wanted to do to Ukraine what the Americans had done in the first Gulf War. That's what they thought their military was capable of doing. Obviously, they had they were sending in paratroopers into Hostomel Airport. They were trying decapitation strikes. They were trying this massive combined arm offensive to decapitate the Ukrainian government and surround the city, parachute people into the airfields around Kiev. And obviously that was a full-blown military disaster for them. Like the Battle of Kiev was a full-blown military disaster for Russia, and it showed that they can't effectively, you know, wage combined arms warfare in the way that, like, say, America can do it.
So this leads me to my final question, which is lay out for me, Drew, the optimistic kind of next 5 years from Ukraine. So something positive about what happens in Ukraine.
Wow, that's very, very difficult. I think the most optimistic picture is that Europe really gets its act together, like Germany and France,
Mm,
and are able to restart, the European defense industrial complex base,
yeah.
pour hundreds of billions of dollars into that, um, and yeah, like they have to. It's going to be really difficult, but they're going to have to try and step in to fill the breach from America, because I think the sad thing is now I mean Trump restored aid and intelligence sharing
Mm,
after a few days, but that breach, I think, just kills trust, and I just can't trust now that we can rely on America to help Ukraine actually end this war on favorable terms. So I think, unfortunately, I mean, we have to look to Europe, and I hope, my big hope is that the coalition of the willing that Keir Starmer is trying to construct in from Britain, is able to fill the gap. It potentially could be enough. I mean, Europe is, at the end of the day, an $18 trillion economy. If they were to properly fill the gap, there is the chance that Ukraine can continue. It's going to be very difficult because there are some parts of the sort of defense industrial base that Europe just doesn't have. Like, for example, there's no good replacement for like the US Patriot missile systems to defend Ukrainian cities. So we would desperately need European allies like France and Germany, Britain, to like ramp up production, or like create their own indigenous systems that
mm.
they can ramp up production. This is really hard because essentially we're asking Europe to federate in a way. We're basically asking for Europe to finally step up as a superpower in its own right. And obviously that's going to be extremely difficult. Unfortunately, you already see like Spain and Italy are kind of like dragging their feet on this, which is sad because Maloney had not been that bad on Ukraine up until now, but
Mm.
we already see Spain and Italy sort of dragging their feet on this. Poland is probably going to have to get its own independent nuclear deterrent. Um, you're going to basically need a lot of European societies to hit 5% GDP defense spending.
I agree with all of that, and as you say, hope that this actually brings Britain closer to the European Union again. We're starting to see some of that, but in Britain, there's such a reticence. But Brexit was such a sort of monumental event. It was so traumatic, and what we're seeing is trying to go back to anything. Just getting closer to Europe on anything is always really difficult. But we can hope,
Yeah,
and maybe Ukraine and Britain will join the EU together someday. Well,
dude, I'd love that. I'd love
yeah,
that. Look, because
yeah,
I think honestly, like the path forward is like a sort of pan-European nationalism. I mean, like a pan-European civic nationalism. That's essentially what we need. We need like Europe to actually think of itself as a superpower, and yeah, like make the decisions that these political elites have been struggling with in France and Germany for so long now. I mean, Germany's just been dragging its feet. Germany has been sleepwalking through history the past 20 years.
mm,
And Britain essentially, yeah, put itself into a coma with Brexit, and has made, unfortunately, so many has made so many disastrous self-inflicted political decisions. We need somehow to have this sort of like revolution when it comes to, when it comes to how people think about Europe, and how European governments work together. I really hope it's possible. I really hope it's possible, because if it's not Ukraine, I mean, if we can't do this now, it's going to eventually get it. All of Europe will be threatened. I mean, there's a paradox here in the sense that, like, obviously, Russia's struggled to conquer the entirety of Ukraine. So people often try to say, oh, well, they can't conquer the entirety of Ukraine. So how can they attack Europe? But look, Ukraine has more men than, like,
mm.
for example, like Ukraine's trying to recruit tens of thousands of men every single month. They've got 900,000 men in the armed forces. UK, Britain has like, I think it's like 90,000 standing soldiers
Mm.
in the actual standing army. Russia is recruiting 30,000 men each single month to its war effort. and that's like 1/3 of the British military being recruited every single month, and they're doing that indefinitely. This is the thing as well. People think maybe it just ends when there's a ceasefire in Ukraine. The mobilization of the Russian economy, Putin has staked his entire political future on that full-scale total war mobilization of the economy. The entire Russian economic elite has been sort of drafted into this kind of plan to rebuild the Russian armaments industry, and he can't then take Russia back into a sort of peacetime society. He can't. It's almost impossible to think like the sort of tension that he's built up in Russian society as a result of all the things that he's done the past 3 years. This is an amazing thing. I mean, I really love the writing of Svetlana Alexievich, the Belarusian writer who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And she has an amazing book called Boys in Zinc, which is about like the sort of, it's like an oral history of the Soviet war in Afghanistan. And when I was reading that, I was like, my God, like the social consequences for the Soviet Union in terms of like all these returning Soviet war veterans, people with, like lifelong injuries and having lost limbs, the reintegration into society. It was so traumatic for, Soviet society. And it was, part of that whole general malaise that ultimately eventually led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that's like, they lost, I think the official number is like 14,000 dead. Maybe in reality it was a couple times higher than that. But like their casualties in Ukraine are like, at this point it's like 20 times or 30 times. And so if you just think about like the level of social catastrophe the Afghan war inflicted on Soviet society, and Ukraine like now doubles, triples that. I mean, no, not even triple. I mean, like 30 times that, 20, 30 times that. This is going to be a really combustible situation. I think in my mind to Italy after World War One, you have all these returning veterans, all these like basically people burning with like, ultra nationalist ideas. Like that's how you saw the rise of fascism in Italy. And I mean, I already think Russia's fascist, but the scary thing is a lot of the opposition to Putin inside Russia is like even more extreme, which is scary.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's a big thing.
yeah,
And I don't think people
yeah,
realize is that it's not just like Putin goes and it's all rosy. Actually, a big difficulty is a lot of the whatever exists of the opposition in Russia can sometimes be more nationalistic, sometimes more
yeah,
authoritarian.
yeah.
That's really tough.
So it's scary. And like, yeah, when you just think to like just the disaster that was the Soviet Afghan war for that society, now you're going to have hundreds of thousands of men returning. You had people, they basically emptied their prisons of, some of the most hardened criminals in Russia, sent them to the front, the ones who returned. You're already seeing reports inside Russia of people who were like convicted murderers. They're back on the streets now because they served in Ukraine, and then they're committing new offenses. So this is just going to be like this really incredibly disastrous time period for Russia. After this war ends, it's going to be a disastrous time period for Russia. And it's just going to be something that we now have to live with for the next 10 to 20 years, like a hyper militarized, hyper ultra nationalist fascist Russia on the doorsteps of Europe. And it's not going to end in Ukraine. And that's the reality. That's why all of Europe now has to rearm.
I
And
totally
yeah,
agree. I agree. And on
yeah.
that cheery note, I shall say thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Drew, for joining me all the way from Brisbane. This has been great. Nick Tyrone, I always screw this up. It's funny when I do this on the radio. I always screw up the name. It's like I have a subconscious difficulty with it. Nick Tyrone, neoliberal centrist dad. My guest has been Drew Pavlov. Thank you for joining me. If you haven't liked and subscribed to all that jazz, you know the routine, please do that. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks so much for having me.
No worries.